What's up, TalkLP News fans? Amber Bradley back in the podcast hot seat. Super stoked to welcome Stephanie Meurer from NAVCO, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing. How are you?
Thank you, Amber. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
So you're busy, right? We've been working on this for I feel like years to get you in the hot seat. I mean, it's been a long time coming.
True story. Absolutely. Yeah, it's been good. I've been in NAVCO for now a year and there's just been a lot of exciting things that are happening.
Yeah.
So glad to finally be here talking with you.
Okay, so we have a cool topic, and if you have tuned in and been like, oh, a vendor, that's not what this is, first of all. Like, we're talking enterprise risk management coming off of Apex. Stephanie helped me out facilitating hospitality track there, which is amazing. So we have gotten close, and this is going to be a really great topic. However, before we get there, I do, if you haven't known what NAVCO is and what they do. Just give us the quick and dirty on NAVCO, and then we'll move into our topic.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. So NAVCO is a security integrator. We've been in business for over 50 years in the industry, and we design, install, service, maintain, monitor security systems. So that's everything from video management systems, access control systems, visitor management systems. So, cameras, card readers, but we do so much more than that. And I think that's what brought us to this discussion today,
Yeah.
where we actually do help come alongside security organizations and security departments to help them holistically come up with a security plan or a security technology roadmap. Whether we do it directly or we can guide you to somebody that can, and there's elements that we can handle on the technology side. That's what we're all about. So I think that's what brought us to this conversation today.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this, just kind of getting to know each other. And it was like, oh, okay, well, I knew what NAVCO did, but to be honest, like I really didn't know this part where if you're a retailer or of any type, hospitality, C-store, whatever, and then need help, like going like I think I've got all my risks covered, but I'm not sure. But which brings us to, we're jumping in to the topic, this enterprise risk management. I had a great session with Scott McBride and Brian Stevens at Apex, and to be honest, like I feel like it's relatively new. I know some other conferences had a session on this, and we wanted to bring it back up at Apex because we felt like it is an emerging trend to where loss prevention and risk management as concepts and departments may not be separate in the future. And I don't know what the future is, right? What, like, this isn't like a 2055 conversation, but this is starting to gain a lot of traction. So start kind of with the beginning for those that are like, Amber, I don't know what you're talking about. Like enterprise risk management from y'all's perspective of when you come alongside a company, as you so well articulated and said, look, are you thinking about this?
Exactly. So I'll start just kind of high level here. So there's a
Yeah.
difference between enterprise risk management and enterprise security risk management. So ESRM, I think, is our focus for the discussion today. And that's a common, you know, confusion point, I'll just say. So just starting there. So you're looking at the broader organization, and really what it's all about is tying the security objectives of reducing risk and tying that to the business objectives of the overall organization. So what it effectively does is it ties the entire security organization closer to what are our business goals and outcomes that we're looking at, and getting closer to what those objectives look like from the standpoint of knowing the business better. So there's a whole cycle that it goes through, from your business goals and objectives to understanding what those assets are that drive those business goals and objectives for success. And then you take it to, and this is where the security realm comes into the picture, is how do we protect those assets? What are those risks facing those assets that are the very assets that will be the success of the organization? So what do we need to protect, and how do we mitigate those risks? And then it goes into the realm of the mitigation plan of okay, now let's take this by department. What do the risks look like in the HR realm? What does it look like in the operations realm? What does it look like in the IT realm? So there's a lot of different dimensions to this discussion. That's why it pulls everything together into that broader discussion about the business objectives and outcomes. So it's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a good summary because I think sometimes people are like, look, I don't do workers' comp or I don't do general liability. And while it may be part of it in an umbrella sense of where you're trying to identify the risks in those categories, that's not all that we're talking about here.
Right, right. That's why that stakeholder discussion is so important when you think about, okay, what departments really touch the aspects of risk? And when you really start to break it down and peel back the onion, you find that, well, gosh, all the departments do touch it in some way or form. And I can give you some other examples as we chat here on this, but it's good to analyze, okay, what are the goals and objectives for, the executive team? What does that look like? What type of risks are they looking to mitigate for the business? As you look at like the business reputation and some other aspects, reducing costs, other priorities. And then when you look at, your operations team, what does their landscape look like? And what do their goals and objectives look like? And then the same thing with IT, same thing with HR, because then you can start to think, and we go through this process of what are all the risks? And we go through a list of like, is it vandalism? Is it, personal injury? Is it incidents and accidents? Is it, loitering? Is it trespassing? Is it shoplifting? Like, what is it? And then we categorize those risks. And in each department, it might look different. So then you get to a point of understanding, okay, what does that look like, our risk tolerance? Okay, do we have it covered through our standard protocols? Or do we really need to examine something further with technology or even some internal processes like employee training to help mitigate those risks in said department?
So talk a little bit about risk tolerance, right? Because in my brain, I'm like, okay, this is like how much risk is acceptable for us to be doing business? Because if it's we're going to mitigate every single risk out there, we might as well just close the door and like let's
Right,
just not be in business because there's obviously risk. So
right.
is that right? Like, is that what you're seeing in the marketplace of like how people are going about this risk
Yeah.
tolerance piece?
That is such a great question, Amber, because it looks different with each department depending on the individual circumstances, like loitering and trespassing. Like maybe it's an issue that's come to play with some facilities, whereas others it's a rampant issue and it's going to escalate to another type of crime, right? Because there's usually indicators with certain risks that are maybe lower level or less important until they start to escalate and they start to increase in frequency, and then then vandalism happens and then theft occurs, right, just from like the loitering. And so these crimes start to escalate. So I think that's one piece of the equation. But there's also, I'm sure, with anyone that's listening to this would think that there's a process that they go through on, from a cost perspective. What does it mean from a cost perspective in their business? Protecting people, property, and assets. Okay, so people first, let's start with that. Okay, so is there going to be any harm to an individual or an employee or any kind of insider or outsider threat? So like there's that, right? And that will be, I would say, a high priority for many businesses out there.
Yeah, keeping your customer and employees safe. Like that's
Exactly.
high up there on the scale of importance.
Right, exactly. And then so when you get into that realm, you get into the conversation of, other risks like outside of security systems, right? You get into the fire systems, right, to protect, the people in the building. Then you get into, barriers, and you get into, just other aspects of the discussion, other special hazards to protect the people. Then you get into, the assets. Okay, so what is the value of this particular asset and what does it look like should my business have to shut down for a day or shut down for 1 hour or 10 minutes or whatever that might look like? There's a cost associated with that. So what does that risk look like in terms of, I mean, even just a simple example would be like even like an elevator, like if you're in a union type of scenario, elevator shut down, and then you have, individuals or air conditioning systems shut down. And then that's also a cost to the business as well, because then you have employees that, will not, they'll either stand off or, not, they'll find a way to, we'll just say there's a pause in the workforce. We'll just
Yeah,
say it like that.
yeah,
So that's a risk too. So this is looking at the whole holistic picture here. Like, even outside of electronic security, it's your processes, it's your other systems as well that are associated with your campus or your facility. And you examine that and then figure out the risk tolerance from there. And then it's prioritized. And then that's how our clients or end users can prioritize like what they're going to budget. Like, is it in the training aspect of the people? And there's typically a budget for that, of course, and then the technology. And then they can figure out, okay, OpEx and CapEx budgets, where do we go from here? So, yeah.
Well, I think what you're describing is certainly like if holistic's probably, an overused word, but in this it's like massively descriptive to what you're saying because, I was just looking at some of the notes that you gave me before this conversation because it's something that like it's almost like if you dove into it, you could just completely get lost, like a ball pit. The little kids dive into and they're completely gone. It's like
Yeah.
there's so many different aspects. So I would say like when you're what's cool, okay, let me back up. What's cool about solution providers like you guys is that you have a varying perspective. Like you can look across, a whole bunch of different retailers or whomever and go, oh, this is what they're dealing with. There's like a whole holistic view of like what's going on. So knowing that like obviously this is a fluid process because there's different risks all the time. No one knew like pandemic, like no one knew that's coming down the road. So what are you seeing like come up that maybe are like, look, we've been working with a lot of our clients on XYZ and it was a surprise to me. And now, I don't know, is it that or is it more like normal things or are there things that are surprising to you as you do these consultations with customers and clients?
Okay, so this is probably the most surprising thing to me that I have found in when we have these discussions is, sometimes there's a perspective when you enter into a discussion that the person I'm talking to, they're going to have all this down. They've got all these things. This is what they think about. They live and breathe this every single day. So here I come and I'm asking these questions, and some of it may be the Captain Obvious questions. Like, of course they know what the risk tolerance looks like. And of course, they know what their landscape looks like. But here's the beauty of it is while we're having the discussion and we go through the list, right? Like of just every single type of risk you can think of, there's usually something and a few things for that matter that come up of, wait a second, that's something that I need to drill into a bit more. And it may be not something that's top of mind because it's not something that's like happening at a high frequency. So, but it's a side note of, wait, we need to address that actually. So part of the process is going through and assessing those risks and then figuring out, okay, well, what kind of assets are we protecting here? And what are those risks to those assets? And now let's like take a bird's eye view, right, of your facility, whether it's a campus facility or whatever the arrangement of your facility. And we'll go from the outside perimeter into your innermost core. Now let's take it a step at a time. And this is the part again that's surprising is you start to think, and maybe some on the security integrator side of the fence might think, well, they're going to have the answers. They can tell me what they need. Well, that's not the case. We're the professionals also in this space that can advise what we suggest as well to be protected, whether we can offer it or not. So in talking about that external perimeter, right, you're talking about like lighting and you're talking about trees, foliage, bollards, and you're talking about fences and things like that. So, sometimes the conversation goes to a place of, yeah, we have had loitering activity. And you know what? There is an opening on this side of, the campus or this side of the building or what have you, right? And so that is surprising because it reveals things that you think maybe were already thought about, but it's okay because I think all of us professionally go into that space of you get into your rhythm and you've got
Yeah.
those high frequency things that you're focused on and maybe the biggest fires, so to speak, right? And, some of those other things kind of fall on the list. So going through that process and actually having that discussion and saying, what's the outer perimeter look like? Okay, now let's get to the building. Let's talk about all the access points and the windows and what do we have for protection there and what are we trying to avoid? And then the innermost core, like your most sensitive computer equipment, right? Your server rooms and things like that. Like how are we protecting that? And that conversation could go from fire protection to security to your standard protocols,
Firewalls or whatever.
all the things, right? Cyber, IT. So you start to find that in this discussion, you're pulling in several departments. It's not something that can be done in a silo. And one example is like when, like, I'll give a cross example, like an ERP system. I know that's something that's a huge undertaking for many organizations, and many professionals will have stories about how that rollout went for their organizations. Well, part of this process with ERP is you need to pull in the parties that are affected by the system functionally, who is in that system. So you need those stakeholders at the table to tell you exactly what's needed in that system. That correlates right here to this conversation with ESRM. It's just an example of like, this is why we need all the stakeholders involved in this discussion, because they're affected by this. They're affected by the mitigation plans, and then ultimately affected by the business goals of the operation. And so when you're rolling it up that way, again, it makes security an integral part of the business goals and objectives. So, just again, kind of going back to your question, I mean, I think that's the more surprising piece is sometimes we make assumptions that like someone's got all the things covered and maybe this is going to be a wasted conversation or they're not going to find value in it. And every time I've been in this discussion, there's always been huge value. And the conversation goes into places that I might not have imagined from the very beginning, because I'm there to listen and evaluate and go through all of the steps. And then it's revealed in that conversation of where those vulnerabilities might live and how we can mitigate those. And then they get to put together a plan, and we help with that too. Like from like, hey, what do you need? Do you want us to write up? Do you need some white papers on examples? You mentioned that a little bit earlier in our discussion. Like, okay, what are some things that we're seeing out there? And how can we justify this if it's not in the budget, right? I mean, that came up in Apex. Like, how do you ask for more budget when this is just not in the plan for the year? Well, what does the ROI look like? And what does it look like in terms of if we don't do this? What does the risk look like? And so we help build out those plans to really support the security teams, in their journey of getting to the best holistic security plan for the facilities.
Well, and it seems like if you're going through each department to identify risk, then you're like, okay, well, when you go to get the budget, it'd have to be a little easier because you're like, oh, well, this what I'm proposing as a solution also impacts this department and this department and this department, instead of just going, oh, well, it's just loss prevention and that's it. I mean, seems straightforward.
Right. Right. I mean, it's simple example like workplace violence, right? Like that's an easy one to just call out like that. Pretty much covers every department like that you can think of, depending on the circumstances, of course. But yeah, to your point. Mhm.
So if our listeners are like, this all sounds great, and I'm not doing this, or my organization is full of a bunch of silos where people don't want to talk about their own stuff. Like, what do you think makes sense to suggest to somebody that's in an organization like that?
Yeah, what I would do in that case, because sometimes it's change leadership, change management, right? Because it's like, okay, we're bringing something new to the table. Sometimes sometimes the defenses can be up because it's like, hey, we're doing this right, and we've always done it this way. So what I would suggest is, encouraging getting ESRM certified, going to the ASIS site and checking it out, taking a look at it, and maybe even dabbling in, there's a lot of articles, there's a lot of videos of information like what is ESRM, and start to wrap the mind around what it's all about, because folks might think, okay, we have a process for this, or we have this all laid out and we're buttoned up. But the beauty is, hey, take a listen to this and see if there's any soft spots that you have in your organization at all. And if you know all these things already, then this is a review for you. But if you don't, then you're going to be able to pick up these nuggets. And what it does is it shows you a framework. It shows you from each perspective of individuals within your organization. So, even if we think we have most of the answers, we don't have all the answers, because there's other people in your organization that have a different perspective to bring to the table. And that's part of the training. The training takes you through, what do those perspectives look like with those stakeholders? How do they respond to risk? What is it that they do? And then you can examine that and say, you know what, we really need to pull in this other department to get their participation. And then what it'll do is it'll spark ideas of how to navigate that landscape within their businesses, and say, I just listened to this ESRM presentation on ASIS. Some people say ASIS, it's ASIS. But I think there's some really great suggestions of how we can enhance our existing security plan. And it's really an enhancement. So like, even if it's an overhaul, that's okay too. Maybe the framework just needs to be cleaned up and organized. That's possible too, of where, there's pieces that are put together that look really great, but then when you're introduced to a new framework, you're like, wow, I thought this looked really good and organized, but now that I see this free framework here, I really like how they laid that out. And that's a good nugget as well to take away from that training. So I would encourage to go to the ASIS site and go to the ESRM segment and really take a look at it and take there's a segment on there that's 2 or 3 hours that you can take just to get your feet wet, if not already exploring the internet, right? I mean, we know how powerful ChatGPT and all the AI platforms are of giving us that information quickly. But I think that they're going to find that when they go through this process, that they're going to pick up new ideas that they didn't have before, or it'll spark a question that they might not have had. So it improves the process one way or the other.
Yeah, it, I think what's cool of what you're talking about in multiple ways is continuing to learn and ask questions, like that you don't know everything. And there are these evolving thought leadership things that are like, okay, all industries don't remain stagnant. Where you're like, oh, okay, I've learned it. Now check, I'm moving on and now I'm doing it. It's like, well, not necessarily. Like things evolve. It's almost like while you were talking, I thought about this, like how loss prevention people, executives used to be known as security, right? And I mean, that's a while ago at this point, but now, then you evolve into, okay, loss prevention practitioner, responsible for shrink. Then here comes the pandemic, and now they've evolved into, okay, loss prevention executive, enterprise security risk executive. I don't know, but it's like, okay, but then they've got safety, they've got vendor fraud, they've got, all of these other things, that it's like, okay, if you think there's not going to be another evolution, or maybe you're just biding your time till you retire, like, it's coming. It's here. You got to continue to evolve with the learnings, right?
Absolutely. No, and you just sparked a thought in my mind too, is that, it's revenue leaks, right? When you're talking about shrinkage and, the whole host of all the things that have happened and what we've learned from the pandemic. And when you think about the role of security, I mean, when we're protecting those assets and really like putting together a holistic plan, it really impacts the business in a huge way, right? Because those revenue leaks are, I mean, it's interesting to look across different businesses and what that impact looks like. So, I mean, security is an integral part of the business goals and outcomes. And so and I think that's sort of the paradigm shift here too, that you just hinted at, is that, the role of the security department and the force out there has evolved to a place of more core to the business as well, not just a bolt on taking care of security and reducing incidents and mitigating, but also looking at the business holistically from the standpoint of helping with those revenue leaks. So it does impact the business. It's not just security, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like it's multi layers forming right before our eyes if the executive is willing to look and learn and uncover kind of what everyone at the highest levels is talking about.
right, right, exactly. It's interesting. I sat this was a panel presentation, so I won't give the names of the individuals or the companies, but it was a really interesting discussion, Amber, because they were talking about like a shoplifting group and how they target retailers. Like, what are the things that they're looking at? And they're aware of the technology. They're aware of what's out there with VMS and AI. They know all the monitoring. They're aware of that. What they look at, and I found this interesting. I just thought I'd pass this along because this does fold into the ESRM discussion on training and making sure you're cross-functional across your entire business from a security standpoint. These individuals would target retailers by how their interactions were with the staff when they enter the facility. You've got the greeting role, whichever title they may be, they come up and they greet you and make sure that you're taken care of. Well, as they go deeper into the store, if they're treated with that same level of attention, they realize, okay, there's a high level of training here. There may be a risk for me. I'm just going to go to an easier target, right? Even knowing the technology that's watching them on the day to day. And when they go into a facility and they see that the other individuals are not as tight and they're not as attentive, they're not as alert, they're not as, focused on them as a buyer, then there's their target right there. So that's a piece of the training element that comes into also ESRM, holistically, because it's everything from physical to electronic security and then training, your inside forces. So it's just a really interesting discussion because you can kind of take this and I know it can be overwhelming, but you can take this in slices and just try to attack it at different angles, whichever angle is the highest priority for those businesses. So I thought that was a really good and interesting example to hear.
Yeah, that is a really good one. But okay, you've given us a lot. We're going to put your contact information into the show notes. So if people want more information on this or even understand more details about what Stephanie's talking about, contact her, link up with her. She will give you the whole rundown. I'm assuming risk is, sitting down and talking through the different risk pieces, which when you were talking about that, it was like, well, yeah, I mean, how great would it be to just sit down and talk shop with someone that could help you discover blind spots that you may not even know that you have.
Exactly. And that's what I've seen come out of these discussions. It's interesting because it's just going through the process and having that discussion. Yeah. So
I love
love
it.
it.
Okay, we're going to put her information in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Stephanie. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Amber. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
very cool. Okay, also some information about NAVCO. Why not? We'll throw that in the show notes too. Thanks so much for listening. This Talk LP podcast. Download the app. Why not? Follow us at Let's Talk LP and sign up for the get all the information, everything you need right there in your fingertips. All right, guys, thanks for listening. We are out.